как родная меня мать провожала. Тут и вся моя родня набежала, тут и вся моя родня набежала. А куда ж ты, паренек, а куда ты? Не ходил бы ты, Ванек, во солдаты, не ходил бы ты, Ванек, во солдаты.
The next really big one happened at the 50th anniversary at the end of the 1960s, when a number of very different but very important films commemorating the Revolution and the Civil War also appeared. I'm not going to be talking about that, actually. I'm going to be talking about Vertov in part, primarily actually about his activities in the immediate wake of the October Revolution. He is, along with Lev Kuleshov, he's probably that specific major Soviet director whose career coincided most directly with the October Revolution. Lev Kuleshov, whom I'll mention a bit later as well, actually began his career in cinema a little bit earlier, but Vertov began right in the spring of 1918. And so there's a real coincidence of his career with the onset of the Russian Revolution. Beyond that, and this again relates to something that Emilio was talking about, in terms of Vertov's own particular position on cinema, and this was a time, of course, specifically, especially the 1920s, a time when people took positions, very strong positions. His position has long been thought of as the most revolutionary of the various positions taken vis-a-vis what a revolutionary film practice should be. That is to say, again, borrowing a term from Emilia, he was the one filmmaker in some ways who really advocated something like a kind of tabula rasa in relationship to earlier film. I'm just going to read to you, this is a famous statement from Vertov that actually expresses fairly well what his overall position was, and hopefully this is at least a little legible. Can you read it more or less? I'll read it out loud anyway so that you have it. Our eyes see very poorly and very little, and so men conceived of the microscope in order to see invisible phenomena, and they discovered the telescope in order to see and explore distant, unknown worlds. The movie camera was invented in order to penetrate deeper into the visible world, to explore and record visual phenomena, so that we do not forget what happens and what the future must take into account. But the camera experienced a misfortune. It was invented at a time when there was no single country in which capitalism was not in power. The bourgeoisie's hellish idea consisted of using the new toy to entertain the masses, or rather to divert the workers' attention from their basic aim, the struggle against their masters. Under the electric narcotic of the movie theaters, the more or less starving proletariat, the jobless, unclenched its iron fist and unwittingly submitted to the corrupting influence of the master's cinema. The theater is expensive and seats are few, and so the masters force the camera to disseminate theatrical productions that show us how the bourgeoisie love, how they suffer, how they care for their workers, and how these higher beings, the aristocracy, differ from lower ones, workers, peasants, and so on. The essential thing in theater is acting. And so every motion picture constructed upon a scenario and acting is a theatrical presentation. And that is why there are no differences between the productions by directors of different nuances. All of this, both in whole and in part, applies to theater regardless of its trend and direction, regardless of its relationship to theater as such. All of this lies outside the genuine purpose of the movie camera, the exploration of the phenomena of life. So what this means is that Dziga Vertov not only advocated a revolutionary cinema that would do away with fiction, what we think of as fiction, that is to say the overwhelming the center of filmmaking basically from the beginning has been the fiction film, doing away not only with that, but doing away with many of the features that are characteristic of fiction filmmaking. For example, the script, right? Building a film around a script. Instead of doing this, taking the camera in hand and later sound in hand to go out into the world and to explore what was going on. This is one of the reasons why, specifically, he's been taken as one of the founding figures in the tradition that we now know, he did not know, but we now know as documentary cinema, as documentary. The word didn't exist at the time that he was working, okay? So this is again, there is a way in which one can describe this as a kind of tabula rasa. Now, the extent to which various aspects of fiction, fictionalizing narrative tropes, conventions, and so on, reemerge in his work, of course, is a very interesting question, and of course they did. And in fact, even in the little thing that I've read to you, you might see that in a way you could, that little story about how the camera had a misfortune, fell into the hands of the bourgeoisie, it is itself a kind of fictional story. It's a kind of an example of what we think of as a romance, right? Those of you who, I actually looked up this expression in Portuguese. It's cinema as a damsel in distress, uma donzela em perigo. Donzela in perigo, right? So a damsel in distress that would be saved by Dziga Vertov and his colleagues in order to put it into to actually give it its real destiny, okay? That's itself a certain kind of a fictional narrative, okay? So I'm going to be talking also, so I wanted to say that just to give you a sense again of the position that he took vis-a-vis cinema, which indeed vis-a-vis the larger history of cinema makes him, in some ways, again, from a theoretical standpoint, kind of a marginal figure, even though he's now become a major figure for a lot of film historians and film critics and film practitioners. There are other, I'm going to be talking about one single aspect primarily of Vertov's work and sort of reflecting on it. I mean, there are many things that could be discussed. For instance, just to talk about it briefly, Vertov was involved in the creation of the very first Soviet newsreel films, which were called, the series was called Kina Nedelya, or Film Week. Those of you who don't know what a newsreel film is, probably most of you have not seen them, that's for sure. These were short news films that were structured to some extent like what we think of as news shows on television, where you would have discrete items. So for instance, a fire, and then, you know, a sporting event, or a visit by someone from a foreign country, and so forth. And these would be, these little films, they were short films, they would be shown before the main theatrical feature film in the cinema, okay, newsreel. Vertov not only was involved in the creation of the first Soviet examples of this, he was even more importantly involved in the restoration of these films. This is something that's very interesting, is that this early series only went on for, it went on for less than a year, just around a year. But a lot of these newsreel films, like a lot of other nonfiction films, the footage was used to make other films. And in the year 1919, Vertov was asked to reconstruct the original form of these newsreel films. This is an extremely unusual thing. It's almost unheard of in the entire history of cinema that anyone would bother to reconstruct newsreel film. Certainly at this time it was totally unheard of. Most of these films were, in fact, thrown into the garbage once they were shown. Okay, there was just no concern for them. What this indicates, among other things, is that and of course this was this was something that was done under the auspices of the Bolshevik state. What this indicates, among other things, is that the historical events, the historical material that was captured in these newsreels was of such importance to the state that they insisted on its early restoration and recovery in its original form. Again, this is something that I know of nothing even remotely like this happening in any other country. And indeed, as you may know, the oldest state film archive in the world was founded in the Soviet Union in 1924, and we have far more early nonfiction and particularly newsreel film from the Soviet Union than we have from any other country. There's really no comparison. In terms of, for instance, the United States, which needless to say produced massive amounts of this, basically we have almost no newsreel, for instance, from the 1910s and very little from the 1920s. Just none. There's Paramount and so forth, right? And we're talking a lot. So that's another aspect of his work that I'm not going to be talking about for the most part. What I am going to be talking about primarily is his work starting in around at the end of 1919 into 1920 on in a certain kind of mobile cinema. And these were, as you can see here, this is the cinema car of a train that was called an agitational train, or usually abbreviated an Agit-Train, Agit-Poist. They themselves were named after they had names that were taken from certain important ideological terms within the Bolshevik lexicon. The train that Vertov traveled on the most was called October Revolution. There was another one that was called Red East, Krasny Vostok, as a matter of fact, that went precisely to the, they hoped, Red East. And there were a number of other trains that were shown. And they ran, for the most part, between 1918 and 1921, this is during the Russian Civil War, in areas that had recently been captured by the Red Army, okay? The White Armies, I should say, also had their versions of mobile agitational trains and cinema as well, which I'll allude to a little bit later. And again, this was something that was done under the auspices of the state, specifically the All-Russia Central Executive Committee. So around these trains, I'm going to sort of weave some thoughts on three themes. One, mobile cinema itself, and cinema as mobility, which is something very important to Vertov's overall conception of things. Propaganda and agitation, which are two crucial concepts for thinking about media practice during this time period, not just cinema practice, but media practice as well. And the encounter with audiences, because that was something, again, Vertov was on these trains primarily to organize the exhibition of film and often to present the films themselves. So he was involved in the exhibition and the explication of films to audiences directly. Okay, so let me move on. Am I so far, you understand what I'm saying so far? Am I okay? I'm not speaking too fast or anything? Or okay, good. Let me know if you want me to, slow down or whatever. So first, this mobile cinema's mobility. So first of all, just about the trains themselves. I want to indicate to you, what is this? This is from a film that I'm going to show you. That's Dziga Vertov himself, sort of chaperoning a bunch of kids into this cinema car that you see here. That's the car right there, and he's chaperoning a bunch of kids into that car. So it's being filmed from inside the car, and there was a little movie theater inside the train, okay? They would also show movies outside, and they would requisition local movie houses. They would project films on the sides of buildings, this type of thing. And it was pretty obvious that from reports that these films were actually among the main attractions of these trains, okay? They had I'm going to talk a little bit later about all the overall functions of the trains. They had a lot of different functions. But one of the things that film was used to do was simply in order to attract audiences of various kinds, from children to adults, various people, local people of various kinds, to the train itself, right, to the train itself. And some of the films that they showed were very much what we would call propaganda films, and some of them were not. Some of them were not. They were of a more entertaining / educational character. The train that Vertov went on, for the most part during the period I'm discussing, went through the eastern part of Ukraine, actually, in an area that was very, very, very heavily hit by Civil War destruction. It was already being afflicted by epidemics and famine already at this time in 1920 in a small scale, and as of course other parts of Russia would get hit much, much more severely just a little bit later. I just want to show you actually this. This is actually. Don't tell anybody at the archive. I filmed this in a clandestine fashion. This is a tiny little clip from the film itself. that I took that still from. So this is actually, so the kids are being brought in a truck to the train, you see. So this is an organized thing, right? So you see the camera showing them rushing enthusiastically to the train. Right. Okay, then the next shot, you see Vertov here leading them along. They go into the train. You see there's a lot of them. You could fit a lot of people into this thing. Okay. They're already holding banners and all the rest of it. They're probably the children of workers for the most part. At least that's how they were designated. I'm going to talk about that later. There's the actual shot that I took that still from as they move in. Unfortunately, we don't have a shot from inside the train. That, of course, is what I would want to have and so on. This is actually not so relevant. So it's actually only the little film that I'm taking it from. It's actually a kind of a residue. It was obviously edited. You can tell that the film was actually edited. This is not raw footage, quote unquote, because it's obviously organized in some way. But it's only that little, about 30 seconds that, or something like that, that pertains to what I'm talking about. This is one of the reasons why I gave my talk here today the title Vertov's Theatrical Origins, because he began as a showman, right? There's a showmanship aspect to this that I'll talk about a little bit more later. I just wanted to say as well that it wasn't only trains, there were also agitational boats, agitational barges on which Vertov and others were involved. This one was the Red Star Literary Instructional Agit steamer. This is probably from 1919. And Vertov himself traveled on this boat a little bit, but he made his most significant early film about this boat, on which traveled very important luminaries, early Soviet Bolshevik luminaries, including Vyacheslav Molotov, and most importantly, Nadezhda Krupskaya, the wife of Lenin, who traveled very extensively on these trains and barges during this time period and spoke to thousands and thousands of people during this time period. Okay, as I mentioned, the White armies, the opponents of the Reds, also had an agit barge, an agitational boat called General Denikin. They had an agitational train called Ataman Kaledin, and so forth. So they had their own little thing going there. So Vertov continued to be involved in mobile cinema through about 1921 and even beyond. And this is actually, I want to show you this film. This is a film from 1922, his film called Kino Pravda Number 10, which was also a kind of newsreel film. It's called Number 10 because newsreels were released in sequence, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this was a film made in 1922 during the beginning of the period of the new economic policy, or the NEP, as we call it, the NEP. And during the NEP, this is something a lot of people aren't aware of, Soviet cinema basically had to be more or less self-supporting. They got some subsidies, but very little. They actually had to make money, not only by making films, but by exhibiting films, renting out equipment. They would get films from abroad and they would show them and all the rest of it. And one of the things that they would do was that they would exhibit films. And this is actually from the end of one of the Kino Pravda films, and it's actually showing how quickly they could organize a film showing in 15 minutes, a mobile film showing. And this film also ends with a completely uncanny moment that sort of looks forward to some of Vertov's own later experimental practices with a certain kind of self-reflexive attitude towards cinema, sort of making us aware that we're watching films and making us aware of the construction of films. How many of you have seen any of Vertov's films, like Man with the Movie Camera? Have any of you seen? Oh, a few of you have. Okay, so you know that film is the exhibit A for self-reflexivity in film, maybe still to this day in all of cinema history, but you see it actually at the end of this film as well. So let's just watch this again from, this is Kino Pravda 10. So these guys, so they take the equipment out, they get out the cart that's in storage, a beautiful shot from inside the shed is wonderful. Bring out and so that's the motor. Okay, and they have very modern transportation equipment, as you can see, for transporting the equipment to their, they have to go to a specific square in Moscow and show a film. So there they go and get everything ready. He puts the camera on the seat, fantastic, or the projector rather on the seat. I mean, this is really wonderful. And there they go, rushing along to get to the place on time to show the film. There they are, they've already arrived at the square. Okay, so the mobile cinema, they actually, oh, no, I was wrong. They get it ready once they're there in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. So this is like a timing thing, right? So keep in mind, this is basically a kind of an ad. Okay, it's an advertisement for mobile cinema. This is how fast we can do this, okay? So if you want a screening, come to us, right? So they put up the screen in the middle of the day, too, which is kind of amazing. So they must have had some kind of like something to block light as well. Get out the wire, people are watching. There's quite kind of an amazing moment here where this guy is smoking. You can see him, because of course film at this time was unbelievably flammable. So these guys were very brave, too. I mean, it would just explode like a bomb, right? Nitrate film. So there he is. I mean, this guy's crazy. Okay, and this is the part that's amazing, which is that suddenly it shifts. They turn on the film, and suddenly you're not sure, are you looking at a demonstration that's in the street where they are, or are you watching something on the screen? Oops, sorry. Let's back this up. So he's got the light on, and then suddenly, and again, there's that slight shift in the frame, right, that makes you aware that something's changed. But wait a minute, is this a film? Is this that we're watching? Are we watching a film that was made in that square, right? It's almost as though there's a kind of a blur between the setting in which the film is being projected and the setting in which whatever film this is, if it is a film, was actually filmed, right? That is that kind of typical, I would say, I don't know if this makes any sense in Portuguese, right? But that kind of moving of the goalposts, I guess it should make sense in Portuguese, in Brazil, especially with soccer and so forth, football, right? But that moving of the goalposts, right? Not being unsure exactly whether or not you're watching film, whether or not you're always watching film, of course, when you're watching a movie, right? But what level of reference is going on. This is something that's very, very typical of Vertov's later film, and we see it already in a rather economical way here. So I just wanted to conclude by also saying that this idea, though, of cinema as something mobile, as something fundamentally about mobility. Of course, the word cinema comes from the Greek word kinesis, right, mobility, right? And something that's really about, that cinema is not a tool for telling fictional stories, fables and so forth, but a tool for appropriating and then redistributing visual and later sonic perception, right? Appropriating it and then redistributing it in all sorts of different ways, moving it into different points, right? This is something that is very, very characteristic of Vertov's later film. So I think that experience of encountering or exhibiting film in that mobile context, right, where there were, radically shifting kinds of audiences that were appearing. Screens would appear in different places. Now, to us, of course, this isn't so shocking because we can watch, Citizen Kane on an iPhone if we want, right, and so on. So we're in this world suddenly now where we have this kind of mobility of screens that's characteristic of our everyday experience, more or less, right? This was, needless to say, not the case with Dziga, Vertov, and so on. So in a certain way, inadvertently at least, we can see him as prophetic of these things. So I wanted to say that this relates even to the plans for his later films. So if you look at the plans for Man with the Movie Camera, which many of you have seen, actually in a lot of cases, the plans are nothing more than lists of camera positions, different places where the camera would move from one place to another, on top of a car, under a car, inside a car, looking up, looking down, looking from left to right, this type of thing, right? And I want to show you this little clip from Man with the Movie Camera to give you, this is from a rather famous section where the camera depicts in rapid succession different stages of life, including birth and death, right? To give a sense that the camera, because of its capacity for mobility and the capacity of editing to combine footage, to combine images, is able to see all of life almost at once, okay? And this is, again, I think particularly powerfully felt in this sequence. So this is actually a marriage registry. So they're getting married, these people. You saw a woman who was, she's already at the end of her life, weeping over somebody who's dead. They're about to start their life. A funeral, a marriage, somebody about to give birth. All these people walking along, all of whom will have their own funeral someday. And then it's as though, it's like, in case you didn't get the message, he puts the camera right into the scene in order to remind you that that's the instrument that's actually enabled you to make all of these connections, right? It's been moving from one place, and even, you might say, from one time to another all along, okay? So that's just one, in a sense, more general kind of speculative point about mobile cinema. I think that's interesting. Now, propaganda and agitation. A rather different theme. The trains were involved in all kinds of different sorts of activities. Film was by no means the most important. There were people who were on board the trains there were members of the secret police on board the trains who were making sure order was kept and so forth. There were people who would go out into the local communities to scout out how things were going and so forth, what shape the schools were in, the hospitals were in and so forth. They took photographs of these places, and then again gathering information about what was going on. Very importantly, there were, as I indicated already, there were Soviet luminaries, very important figures in the government who traveled on the train. On the October Revolution train, the most important was this guy, Mikhail Kalinin, who remained sort of a fixture in the Soviet regime right until his death in, I guess, 1945 is when he died. And Vertov traveled extensively with him on these trains, and he was a big attraction, so that he would give speeches to very large crowds, and there would be actual discussion with people. We even have transcripts of debates that he would have with people in the crowd and so forth, right? So, but one of the main functions was that, or the two of the main functions were that of propaganda and agitation. Now these are terms that now for us, again, I don't know about usage in Portuguese. It'd be very interesting to hear about this, but for us they tend to be, agitation tends not to be a word that we use really very much, and there's a word that eventually emerged, agit-prop, which was the name actually of a subdivision within the Soviet state that was to deal with this. But at the time, and this is something that derives from social democratic, left-wing media practice already in the late 19th century, there was a very clear distinction between these two things, between propaganda and agitation. Agitation meant the delivery of a very short, sharp bit of information, a slogan or something, to try and get people to do something. Okay, you know, clean up the city, you know, wash your hands, right, this kind of thing, right? Enlist in the army, okay? That's agitation, okay? Propaganda, by contrast, was pedagogical. Propaganda involved sitting down with somebody and explaining them to them, for instance, the character of the capitalist economy and its basis in exploitation, or the history of the workers' movement, or something like this, right? Propaganda was something that took time, in other words. It took time. It was a form of explication. And this is something that's very, very clear when you look at discussions about media practice during this time period. And it's again, something that goes back, if you read the work of Plechana, for instance, on newspapers and so on, this is very, very obvious and so on. I'm wondering too, propaganda does have different meanings in different countries. In Argentina, for instance, propaganda can also be used to talk about commercial advertising. See, I love this. I think this is a usage we should import into English, actually. This would be very useful for a whole variety of reasons, to call that propaganda. But we don't do that so far in any case. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, the Agit-Train people would also, the agitators, one of the things they would do upon arrival is that they would put posters all over the place. Okay, in the town, they would tack them up and so forth. But the trains themselves were covered in these murals, these paintings, okay, that would depict various things, historical things, but what they were basically covered with were propaganda and agitational messages. And the structure of these messages is something that's very interesting to think about. It's a very useful way to illustrate the difference, okay? So on top, actually in some ways I can show you this one's a little easier. So here you have, this says, fix the bridges. That's agitation. Fix the bridges. Okay, do it. And obviously, even from quite a distance, if the train was going by, someone could read this and sort of get the message of what was going on. Okay, just do it. Along the bottom, now you can't really see it here, it actually talks about the White Army having, why do this? Because the White Army blew up all the bridges. So there's a historical explanation that runs in smaller type, smaller printing along the bottom, okay, that would explain why you need to do this, okay? You know, clean up the city, and then on the top, and then on the bottom, why do this, and so on? Because otherwise we'll have more epidemics than we already have, something like this, right? And there's evidence that propagandists, people who were on the trains, would actually stand there alongside the train, and they would point to these things, and they would use them as occasions for this kind of pedagogical practice, okay? So that distinction, very, very important. And again, it's something that's interesting to think about, agitation in particular, in terms of, how could you say, the more avant-garde sides of early Soviet media practice, because of course, in a way, I mean, agitation is all about delivering shocks, delivering short, sharp messages, right? So those moments in Soviet film when you get sort of flashes of light or kind of like jarring cuts and sharp things, those are in a way, in some ways, the most formalist, the most avant-gardist moments in those films, but they're also in a way the most agitational. It's not probably the most famous agitational poster ever made is this one, El Lisitsky's Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, which is pure agitation. I mean, that is agitation. It's not propaganda. It's agitation, right? In that particular sense, or at least it's intending to be agitation. It probably didn't work that well, but it may have had that effect for some people. Now, I want to talk again. I'm bringing this up in part because Vertov had no previous revolutionary pedigree. He was not a member of the revolutionary movement, so his education in all of this happened to a large extent on the Agit-Trains. Okay, in this kind of practice, propaganda, agitation, and so forth, right? And it continues to be part of his work later, and I want to show you a couple examples. One very interesting one from his first Kino Pravda film, Kino Pravda meaning Film Truth, from June of 1922. And this begins, and what you see here is a very, very clear illustration of the shift between, or the way that something that is initially agitational is sort of shifted gradually into something more like a propaganda message. So this is happening during the latter phases of the terrible famine in the Volga area, which is what you're going to get an indication of here. And I'm going to stop this a couple times. So Kino Pravda #1, okay, that agitation right to begin with, save the starving children. Boom. Right in your face. And these films, by the way, this was again during a famine. During the screening of these films, they would gather money and so forth, collect money for famine relief. So what we see here are a sequence of really quite terrible images of, as you'll see, of indeed starving kids. This is a very interesting image that I want to talk about just very briefly. Now, this is not an image of starving kids. It's a panorama of a scene that's sort of strange, like a city and so on. Why would they be showing this? Any idea? This is the scene when they would be. Why would they suddenly show this? What is that, by the way? That all those logs and so on. It's a roof, right? What would it normally be covered with? A roof that had those logs. It would normally be covered with straw. Straw, okay? There's no straw. Why was there no straw? Because the people ate the straw. The people ate the straw. And already one of the most famous tropes of this time and the famine propaganda or agitation, right, was that the straw on the thatched roofs had been eaten by the people. Even that didn't exist anymore. Of course, you can't eat straw because there's no nutrients in straw. But it doesn't help you really, right? But that's what happened. So this is something, it's like a kind of a coded message to people at the time, right? So again, you have to have a certain sense of the overall context in order to decode some of these messages. So here we go on to the main part of this first section. So someone on the train throws out some garbage, which is then eaten by either kids in adult coats. So this is the Melikis station there, and these kids who have been completely ravaged by hunger are waiting for the arrival of a sanitary, sort of an aid train from the center and so on. This was a place, by the way, that received quite a bit of aid from the United States during this period. There's actually some visitors from the U.S. There was a U.S. aid agency that was there, and there's some interesting testimony about this specific place. I'm not even certain. This may even be footage that was shot by Americans. I'm not certain. It's not totally clear to me. I won't get into it now, but it's possible. So this is the first item again of the newsreel. Okay, this is the first section. So the first section: starving kids in Russia. Okay, no more strength. So another agitational moment, right? And we have agitation like this to this day, right, on television and so forth. And you see images of young children often starving and so forth in various, so thrown to the whims of fate. Thrown to the whims of fate. Vertov, by the way, would reuse some of this footage later. So this is now that's the final image of the section. Now this is item 2 on the seizure of church valuables in Moscow. So this is now suddenly we're in topic number 2, just like a newspaper. Okay, so at this time, the Bolsheviks, for a variety of reasons, were seizing valuables from the churches in Moscow. Okay. And so what this is about the process of this going on, and they try to present it as something that's very organized and rationalized and so forth, with experts there assessing the value of gold, pearls, and so forth from things like, so this is the sorting out things that have been seized in the state warehouse, right? So they're actually meticulously going through and taking pearls and other gems out and so forth. Experts who are there, right? So again, it's a very different kind of a theme than we had in the first part. Now we suddenly get propaganda. It says, every pearl saves a child. Now this is very interesting because that goes back to the first item. So in other words, why are we doing this? What's the explanation? What's the explication for the specific act of seizing the church valuables, okay? The reason is this, right? Being able to feed the kids, right? That's propaganda, okay? Propaganda is that. Propaganda is establishing that kind of connection and rationalization as to why a specific policy is being enacted, okay? So that's, again, so one of the things about Vertov's films is that they actually, I won't show you the rest of this, that they actually, how could you put it? They're about the distinction between propaganda and agitation. They're about media practice as much as they engage in it, right? Now, I want to show you, do I have a lot, how much more time do I have? Do I have some more time?
20 minutes.
Oh, 20 minutes. Okay, maybe I will, because this is so, I'll see if I can get through this. 20 minutes. I want to show you an example from a famous later film of his called Kino Eye meaning cinema eye, from 1924, that also illustrates this distinction in a very, very interesting way. It became more and more elaborate as time went on. And what this film is about, or this part of the film is about, are members of the Young Pioneer organization, who were the Soviet Boy and Girl Scouts, who are going through a marketplace in Moscow in 1924, and they're sort of taking down notes, and they're sort of giving information as to how much these private traders who were working during the new economic policy were ripping everybody off, right? And who were deceiving people. And they're also trying to agitate for people to not shop in the private market, but to shop in the state cooperative, okay? And so that's what you're going to see here. It's really quite complex in a way. So here you see this young, these young people there, and now you see two. That's the mother of one of these two girls. It's actually quite complexly edited. So you see one of the girls there. You saw she had a tube in her hand. You'll see what she has there. So that's the mother, and she's there, and she asks the tradesman how much it costs. It seems like it's a little expensive for her. She doesn't buy anything anyway. Now, what do? They're going up as agitators, and they're putting up an agitational sign, okay? Now, and they're getting laughed at by the traders who think this is funny, of course, right? And they're all fat, of course. So this is, now, what's going on here? So the mother is still marching through the marketplace and so forth, trying to find some meat. The pioneers are there, and the mother happens upon this. And here's the agitational message. Oops, sorry. Don't give any profits to the merchants and so forth. Buy in the co-op. So don't do, right? Agitation. Okay. Now why? Now that's the job of the cinema eye to explain why this should be. Why would you take this advice? What's the reason? Now here starts the propaganda message. So she goes to the cooperative. Sorry, I'm going to show you a little bit of this. This is a little gross at one point. But anyway, because we're talking about meat, just, trigger warning, as they say in English. So the cooperative receives money directly from the slaughterhouse. The key word here is the word directly. Directly. So the Kino-eye moves time backwards. So they go all the way back into the slaughterhouse. Okay, so they've got, again, indicating that it's kind of, it's very orderly and so on. This is, 20 minutes ago, this was a bull. So what you get now is that Vertov shows the slaughtering of a bull backwards. So people pouring back the intestines into the bull. Sorry, I told you it was gross. Okay, so this is gross, right? But this was, you know, this is trying to make it memorable, you see. So they keep on doing, you'll see they not only put all the intestines back in, they put the skin back on. We get the resurrection of the bull. I should say, too, when Vertov was a kid, this is in a memoir, he once wandered with his brother into a slaughterhouse and saw the slaughter, and it traumatized them. They were shocked, and they became vegetarians for a while. Their dad was a vegetarian, and so this, I think, is maybe a response to this as well. But anyway, the key thing is this: is that you follow the everything going on all the way back to the fields. All the way back. We go on the train, we get all the way back to the fields, right? And the key thing about this is that you show the whole process of meat, right, being produced and so forth, from the field, from meat back to the fields, and at no point is there a merchant or a middleman involved, skimming off profits. At no point. There's nothing there. There's no need for this. There's no need for it. It can be produced, it can be distributed without that person being involved at any point in the process. That's propaganda. That's propaganda, okay, right? Again, in a very interesting kind of way. So this is the last thing I want to talk about. Encounter with audiences. As I said, now, in the cinema car, Vertov, they showed films, and I'm not going to go into detail about what kind of films they showed, but they showed educational films. They definitely did show propaganda and agitational films. They showed some rather popular cartoon films, animated films from the pre-revolutionary period, including some by some of you may have heard of Stadevich, very famous Stadevich, right? They showed some of his films. They were the most popular films. And Vertov was not only involved in showing films to kids and others, but he was involved in every day in doing these daily reports as to what films were shown, where they were shown, how many people came, which films they liked the most, what were their responses, and so forth. So this is just one example. That's Vertov's signature right there, right, of these reports where you would get all this, again, this information about what was being done. And of course, these things are just gold. I mean, it's fantastic to have this because it gives you an incredible amount of information about where the train actually went, what was going on, who was attending them, and so forth, and how they thought about who was attending them, like what categories they used in order to describe the audiences themselves, right? And he often talks about the kinds of, the way in which he would give explications to the films, right? Because of course these are silent films. I should say there was usually, in terms of the presentation of the films, there was a piano inside the movie theater too. And Vertov was a pianist, and he would also sometimes provide, I think, rather elaborate piano accompaniment, I suspect. Right? So one of the reasons I bring this up is because those of you who've seen Vertov's films, and even Man with the Movie Camera would be sufficient, know how much the idea of the presence of the audience, the way that audiences are brought into the film, and the way that the idea of direct contact of you, the film viewer, with somebody looking at you, at the screen is a huge part of what goes on in his films, right? This is very much the case in the film from which this is drawn, 1/6 of the World, which is a whole sort of case unto itself. Man with the Movie Camera, with its repeated representation of people looking at the camera, audiences, and so forth, right? In fact, Man with the Movie Camera began, the initial idea of Man with the Movie Camera was he wanted to explore the effects that the movie camera would have on people in real life. So if you put the camera into a place, what happens? What do people do? This was the original idea that he had, the core for the entire film. and so on. And this also relates to something that Emilia said yesterday and so forth, that focus, that interest in the propaganda at this, during this period of the relationship of looks, right? The crowd to the leader and so forth, right? The mirada, as you said, right? This is a big question, right? It goes on too until his later film, Three Songs of Lenin, which is very much continues this. So this is not something that ends at the end of the 1920s at all. It's something that continues very much into the 1930s. I don't know how many of you have seen Three Songs of Lenin from 1934, but it's a very, very interesting instance of this. But I want to show you one kind of film that illustrates this in an interesting way. Hopefully I'll have time for this. It's a short film that is also characteristic of this period in some ways, and there's some interesting things about audiences. And it was also a kind of film that was shown on the trains. And these were these films that were made, anti-religious films, made during the Civil War, about the exposure of the remains or the relics of Orthodox saints. According to popular Orthodox belief, the saints, the Orthodox saints, or the remains of the saints, or many of the saints, did not decay. They were not subject to putrefaction. They didn't decay. Okay, and the Bolsheviks, what they did in several cases, they went into the churches and they would open these things up and have a public demonstration of the decayed relics. And in about 5 cases, they filmed this. They filmed the procedure. Okay, and I'm going to show you the most famous example of this. This is the exposure of the relics of Sergius of Radonezh, the most famous of all Russian saints. This is in a place now called Sergiev Posad near Moscow. I'm going to turn off this because there was no soundtrack. This is a version of the film that was shown on Russian television. So you get a sense of the city and so forth there. The beginning, going into it, and there's really only one particular shot that I want to, or rather one juxtaposition that I want to focus on. Let's see if I can, I'm actually going to skip ahead here a little bit. So what you had for the most part in this film, you have the procedure that was done under the auspices of armed people by priests who would be forced to open up these boxes and expose the remains of the saints, okay? And later on, people would be paraded past these things to see the exposure, like ordinary local people would be paraded past to look at the exposed saints. So I can actually, if any of you are interested in this, I can send it to you. But at a couple points during the film, eventually, of course, it begins with this kind of a mummified figure, and at the end, you see, of course, the skull and so forth. But at a couple times in the film, you get this. You get this image of the crowd as though they're watching this. Now, this is a very, very interesting image that I'm going to return to. And this image is repeated about 3 times at some length during the course of the film, okay? And I want you to think already about why this is there. The Bolsheviks, at this time, one of the reasons they did this was, one of the reasons they filmed them was because it was thought of that the film itself, as a film, was also a kind of a demonstration of the superiority of science, modern thinking, modernity, to superstitious ideas. And this is actually a very telling quote from the writing of a guy, very interesting guy who was a major scholar of law, kind of a left-leaning liberal scholar who ended up writing propaganda pamphlets for the Bolsheviks, Mikhail Reisner, who was a teacher at the university that Vertov went to. It's called Must We Believe in God? And I just want to read this because it's such an interesting text to sort of give you a sense of this ideology. If one compares what we achieve today with the help of science and technology with the miracles wrought by some old gods or other, then it turns out that we have long since surpassed all of these creators and makers and their powers. The briefest overview of our achievements will provide sufficient proof to show who is stronger now, the new human being or the old God. And if it's necessary to prove the power of humanity to call up the dead from their graves, to make them speak and to display them to our sight as though alive, then that too has been achieved. On the gramophone record, human speech is recorded for an eternity. A reflection of our lives is laid upon cinematic film. And it is only a matter of placing the images of those long, silent, and forgotten into an electrical machine, and they will rise before us as though alive, speaking to us again in their authentic voice and language. It's not necessary now to turn to the prophetess or the sorcerer. There's no need to pray to God. We ourselves resurrect the dead for our eyes and ears. And I can go into more detail about this, but this was something that they actually thought of in a fairly programmatic way in terms of actually displaying photographs and cinema and so on. But I want to get back to this image of the people, because it's very weird in a way, because first of all, why would you need this in a film? If you're showing the exposure of the relics, why do you need to have a picture of these people? Okay, that's one thing that's interesting. Two, where's the exposure of the relic? Where was it happening? You could tell from the film. It was happening deep inside the cathedral itself, the church itself, whereas these people are standing outside. They're standing outside in the square. They're not inside the cathedral at all. So there's a juxtaposition between them and the relics as though they're looking on this, but in fact, right, as though they're sort of responding in some way to the sight of the relics as we are. But if you think about it, they weren't. There's no way that they were. This is a juxtaposition that was happening purely in the case of this film by virtue of cinema, okay? This should remind you of something, those of you who know cinema studies. It's very interesting historically. Vertov, there's a controversy about this film, about whether or not this film was made by Dziga Vertov or if it was made by Lev Kuleshov, who was also on the agitational trains and also made films like this. Why should you, those of you who study cinema, should be interested in this? Because this, of course, is a perfect example of the Kuleshov effect, right? That is to say, where the juxtaposition of two images, you know, a face with a dead body equaling sadness, a face with soup equaling hunger, a face juxtaposed with a beautiful woman, making us think of lust. So again, the idea is that because when we're watching a film, we're inclined to find order and coherence. We think that the order in which images are presented should make sense. So we're looking for sense. So when we see a juxtaposition like this, right, of faces with hunger or faces with soup or faces with exposed relics and so forth, we are led to interpret them in a certain way, okay, because we are actively hunting for meaning within a film. This is more or less what's happening in this film as well. One of the things that's interesting, though, about Vertov's things, and this is sort of where I'm going to conclude, is that Vertov's use of these kinds of juxtapositions is often kind of weak. It's not really, it's not, in a way, you know, so obviously in a sense there's a way in which these people are supposed to have some kind of a response to this. Is it shock? Is it, I mean, you can look at the faces yourselves and decide what the response is, right? Is it surprise? Is it disappointment? Is it, but it's not clear. It's left very sort of vague in a way. And that's something that's characteristic of Vertov's use of these juxtapositions. And that's something that is, again, relates to that earlier point I made about the mobility of perception. We're somehow, even though we're I think, meant to interpret what their expression as some kind of a response to the exposure of the relics, we're also aware that they have of their perception as something autonomous, as something that's as their own, as a separate kind of a power, right? They're also looking, right? Just like the camera is looking, just like we're looking at what we're seeing. And that's, I mean, you can almost define cinema that way if you want. I mean, cinema is basically a structure of gazes, right, ultimately, right? And this is, even a simple juxtaposition like this gets to that. And I just want to show you another example. This is from his film 1/6 of the World from a few years later, 1926. And this is a beautiful example where the sailors on board a ship with Sami people in the north who are trading furs with this with the state trade organization. They're brought onto the ship and they sit down and the sailors play for them a recording of Lenin speaking. Lenin, who was, of course, by that time dead. On the gramophone, they hear the voice of Lenin himself. Right? and there's this marvelous, so we see that there's a gramophone, right? And then there's this interesting, now we don't actually know when we see the people there, we don't know that they're actually listening to the record at the time at all. I mean, this is a pure cinematic juxtaposition, right? But again, there's that interesting way in which you sort of, there's that sense that some kind of a response is happening, especially here, but you're not really fully able to characterize it. You know, what exactly are they thinking about this? Do they care about it? Do they, et cetera? And that's kind of typical, again, of Vertov's use of these kinds of juxtapositions, in contrast to the use by Eisenstein or others, right? So, again, I just give you that example. Again, there's a certain kind of simultaneously, there's a way in which, how could you put it? There's a tension between sort of displaying that mobility of perception and this need to understand perception, to sort of pin it down, to fill it with a certain kind of meaning, okay? So that's really primarily what I wanted to say about the Agit-Trains. And so the upshot really is that Vertov, during his experience with the Agit-Trains, really acquired, sort of imbibed a lot of practices, knowledge, and so forth that he would use in his later films, and that were important for the works of other filmmakers as well, and that really, in spite of the fact that some of these things seem very crude in many ways and sort of simple, propaganda versus agitation, actually took on rather sophisticated forms in his later work that are that I don't think have been sufficiently appreciated in the previous accounts of his his films and the work of other people. So that's where I'll end. Obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. We have some time for discussion. Luiz Felipe.
Luiz. Yeah.
Microfone, talvez. O que vocês acham? Tá. Microfone, ou então resume. Talvez possa pegar o microfone para já sair direto aí. Melhor.
My question is related to Vertov's, it's related to his relation with audiences, but about a later moment on his career, kind of later moment in the mid-20s when he wanted the audiences to become filmmakers themselves.
Right.
I mean, Vertov and the Cine group, they had like this educational and, agitational propagandistic approach also to filmmaking, as though they organized circles of amateur filmmakers. But what I wanted to know is what kind of documentation exists of these circles, of these practices, because I know there are a few letters and Vertov mentions it, but what is there about it?
Yeah, it's a great question, because this is one of the things that's most often mentioned in relationship to Vertov as a radical filmmaker. One thing I did not say was that Vertov, talking again about the tabula rasa and the revolutionary character of Vertov's work, Vertov went so far at various points in his career in the 1920s as denying that what he was doing was not only fiction, but it wasn't art at all. So there was a denial even of the category of art. But beyond that, at this point, as Luis is saying, there was an effort to get outside the category of the author, to basically, and of course the technical limitations here prevented this from happening, but basically to kind of disseminate cameras or cinematic technology through the populace in order to create this kind of a generalized cinema eye in a certain way, right? A kind of democratic cinema practice that would involve people reflecting on themselves and on their own lives and on their own films rather than watching authorial film. The main period to which this pertains really is sort of the middle, or sort of the spring of 1924 up to the beginning of 1925. And so it coincides both with the beginnings, or some of the early stages of the pioneer organization. Vertov was connected with various people who were in a specific pioneer troupe whom you see in the film, associated with a factory in Moscow, as well as others who were in a village outside of Moscow. And one of the pioneers who he was in contact with in the village became one of the most important of all Soviet documentary filmmakers, a guy named Ilya Kapalin, who became one of the central figures in the entire history of Soviet documentary. There were other people as well who became significant in their own way. So there was, but they became authors, right? There wasn't this grand collective thing, right? And again, as I said, technical, he did give still cameras to a group of pioneers in Moscow, and they produced with this their own little journal. And there was a way in which still camera shooting, still photography, did kind of flow into some of the early media practice of the young pioneers. There was a pioneer journal called Baraban, drum, and in the 1920s you can see examples of kino eye photography that was done with that label on it, that was done by young pioneers who were shooting very sort of standard kind of documentary photography. In some ways, they're almost shooting like selfies, like somebody beside a well and going like hi. And I mean, it's actually not very propagandistic or anything in many cases. And this changes, of course, this stops after a few years, basically, and that was another problem, is that the pioneers were under the auspices of the Komsomol organization, and I found a wonderful letter that said that indicated that this particular pioneer troupe was much too concerned with cinematic technology because of the overweening interest of certain members of the film studios in them, right, getting them to do this, right, so that they were. But so, in other words, Vertov sort of took advantage of that in order to get these kids involved, right? And some of it had, in certain cases, has something of a lasting effect. There was some correspondence with cities as far away as Tula, Odessa, actually, in one case, and so on. So there's not a lot of surviving correspondence. It's hard to say. The other thing, though, that this relates to, that's very important, that had a long-lasting effect, is the so-called worker correspondent movement that some of you may know something about, right? That was started basically by the state journalistic organs itself, right? The so-called rabkori, right? Who were people, non-professional journalists who would be sort of asked, sort of encouraged to write articles describing what was going on and so forth, and that they would be published, of course, in much edited form. And it was so, yet this was, again, a kind of a very controlled kind of an enterprise. There's a certain mystification involved in this, and it's a certain kind of a specter, in a way, of democratic journalistic practice rather than the real thing. Vertov, though, did adopt the language of the worker correspondent movement. So he actually referred to these people as not, so kor stands for correspondent, correspondent. Rab means worker, rab kor, worker correspondent, and he called his people kino kor, right? Cinema correspondent, right? And but it was very, how could you say? It remained on the level of a desideratum, of a desire more than anything else, but not, again, without certain kinds of consequences for journalistic practice, mainly associated with the pioneers, and particularly still photographic practice and so on. When does it end? It ends when Vertov becomes successful with his kinopravdas, especially his film from January 1925, the Kinopravda number 21, dedicated to Lenin, which was this big hit, and he becomes this big author himself, in a way, and ends up abandoning this for a variety of reasons. He gets a whole slew of different projects and so forth, and he shifts off to becoming Dziga Vertov, in a way, right? So in a way, he's also becomes entrapped, though not without resistance, by the category of the author and so forth. I don't think that Vertov's, some people at the time even thought that Vertov's effort to create this democratic sort of cinema practice was a kind of was a kind of facade, that in a way he was just trying to sort of develop more followers for himself and so forth. I don't think that's the case at all. I think there was a real interest in putting pressure on the existing institution of cinema production at this time, right? But it was, you know, as with many other things, many other utopian projects, it couldn't be fulfilled. So I hope that answers the question a bit. Yeah, thanks. Other questions? Thoughts? No. Thoughts?
Tem, mas se tiver no horário posso depois. Okay, so just one more quick question.
Sure.
More like a commentary or something about the last thing you said about the feeble connections that Vertov establishes between in the juxtapositions that he does compared to Eisenstein, especially, you know, the fact that it's not there necessarily, the connections that we see in the cadres that show the people and the gramophone. I think it derives from the fact that, well, he's using material that is supposed not to be staged. So it derives from his own practice.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I mean, that is one of the fundamental features, I think, that attracted him about non-fiction material, right? Is that in contrast to there's a way in which if a film, I mean, you can look at almost any film if you want as a kind of a documentary. I mean, it's possible to do this, right? But if you look at a film as a documentary, what you're looking at, you have to sense that it has its own kind of weight and inertia. It has to be in some way autonomous, right? It's like when you watch a fiction film, the whole film was done for you, right? It was made for you. It was staged for you. The actors were picked for you, the audience, and so on. In a nonfiction film, that's not the case. Those people were not sitting on there for you, the audience. They were captured. They were on there for a different reason. They were on there to meet the sailors and so forth, right? The sailors were there to trade their furs and so forth, right? In other words, in nonfiction, it's like you're always coming a little late to what you're seeing, in contrast to a fiction film, which is, again, it's directed from the very beginning toward you as a consumer of the product, right? And that is something I think that he pays homage to in this way in which he makes he prevents that sort of linkage. He needs to have some kind of a structure and a linkage and a sense of response, right? And so on, but he leaves it relatively open in that particular respect, right? And that's, I think, again, this is one of the reasons, by the way, why a lot of people don't like documentary, I think. I have a moonlighting job I'm a moderator of a film club, and many times when we show a documentary, people just, they don't say, they say, why did you're showing us a documentary instead of showing a movie? Seriously, people have said this, showing a movie. Why? Because it's not for them. The material wasn't done for them in quite the same way, right? Whereas for a movie, from the very beginning, like from the script, from the point of the script, it was done for you, audience members and so forth. Whereas documentary has a very different sort of, I don't know what the right word is, a kind of resistance in a way, a different weight vis-a-vis the audience, right? And I think that in a lot, not always. I mean, Vertov can be pretty manipulative too. I won't give you an example, but he can be. But I think in a lot of cases, we sense this respect, I say, which is necessary for documentary. Yeah. Great question, by the way.
Vamos agradecer mais uma vez ao professor John MacKay e intervalo de 10 minutos, tá bom? Obrigado.
Thank you.
Как родная меня мать провожала, тут и вся моя родня набежала, тут и вся моя родня набежала. А куда ж ты, паренек, а куда ты? Не ходил бы ты, Ванек, во солдаты, не ходил бы ты, Ванек, во солдаты. В Красной армии штыки чай найдутся, без тебя большевики обойдут.